So about a month after Tears of the Kingdom dropped, I found myself needing to touch some grass, and so I drove around Iceland sleeping in a van the whole time. And I really was living like Link. I was cooking in the wilds. I was changing outfits for different conditions, campsites and gas stations quickly became my personal stables, and every single time I found myself out of the wild and back in civilization, that stable theme immediately lived rent-free in my mind. Towns had silly side quests for me, there were absolutely tons of horses, and I would argue Hyrule's map is extremely reminiscent of Iceland, volcanoes and all. Hell, I even chopped off my hair to match Princess Zelda. And video games have been changing my life for, well, all my life. I wouldn't have a biology degree if it wasn't for Pokemon. I wouldn't be into sailing if it wasn't for the Wind Waker. And the last game that truly changed my life and my behaviors was Death Stranding, where I am now much better at keeping in touch and more or less never leave people on red. So about a month after Breath of the Wild dropped, I found myself hiking the Grand Canyon for the second time in my life. And when I was at the Grand Canyon, all I could think about was Zelda. I just wanted to leap off and whip out a paraglider, glad I didn't try. And the same thing was happening during my trip in Iceland. So was I just role-playing a Zelda fantasy for myself? I mean, it's entirely possible, but here's the thing. I 100% credit video games, particularly Zelda and Pokemon, for instilling me with a sense of adventure, but Breath of the Wild did in fact change the way I travel. I need to craft a goal-driven adventure for myself to accomplish with side quests along the way. I need to explore on my own without the burden of tourist trappings. Be that on a train trip around Japan where I shoot a Steam Deck review and a Sekiro review, or a road trip around Iceland where I shoot a Zelda review. My past travels have always been immersive and sedentary, hanging out in Germany for 6 months as an example, but since Breath of the Wild, the shift has been to more solitary and kinetic, kindling the energy and the emotions Breath of the Wild gave me in real life. So how does Tears of the Kingdom play a role in all this? Well, between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, there was a period where travel was more or less off the table. So Tears of the Kingdom not only rekindled the fire that Breath of the Wild started, but elevated a thirst for non-linear exploration with an open-ended main objective, be that drive around Iceland with no other real itinerary, or even in the core philosophy of how I plan to achieve the next steps in my life. And you will all continue to see this exemplified in future reviews, and if video games can instill such a fundamental change, then it's a damn good video game in my book, and Breath of the Wild is one of my top 5 video games ever made. And with the release of Tears of the Kingdom, it's absolutely wild to think that we have now known this Link for about 10 years now. It is extremely rare to be blessed with direct sequels to Zelda, so let's dig really deep and talk about Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. And this video is timestamped if you want to check out my thoughts on any particular section, and if you made it this far, please hit that like button, and Pikmin 4 is the next video, so definitely subscribe so you don't miss it. Nintendo was in a bit of a predicament when making a sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. On the one hand, the game had an unbelievable sales and rocketed itself up to be one of the best reviewed games of all time. On the other hand, there was a healthy amount of criticism mounted towards Breath of the Wild. The weapon durability system, the divine beasts, and repetitive shrine structure as a few examples. Basically, it was a divisive game for fans of the series, which is only natural considering how much had changed. So Nintendo was essentially walking a tightrope, keeping die-hard Breath of the Wild fans happy, while pivoting back just enough to traditional 3D Zelda. Nintendo was finally able to drop the weights of the Wii U, and that only amplified the pressure of pushing the Switch to higher highs. So naturally, reusing the old map and charging $70 was the way to go, am I right, fellas? Hey! Seriously, though, when I first heard this map was being reused, I had instant doubt. And this has never backfired for sequels before, guys. Yes, Tears of the Kingdom does reuse the same map, but simply in a brilliant way which embraces the spirit of the game. So we have already seen this map, let's break it. Literally with massive chasms, sky islands, caves, and more. But also let's break it figuratively, with new locomotion mechanics. A huge part of Breath of the Wild was discovering the massive entity that was Hyrule. A huge part of the map design is focused around using peaks and valleys to show and hide points of interest, so it seems almost sacrilegious to throw all that away. Won't adding sky islands and effectively airplanes ruin that sense of discovery? Well, yeah, and that's kind of the point, because the map is no longer an unknown entity. Nintendo can treat it entirely with irreverence, and the sense of discovery pivots from exploring the map to exploring creative means of transit, getting places faster, getting Korok's places, right guys? And accenting that enhanced ability to zip around the map with subtle changes to the core map, like new shrines, wells, and Hyrule Castle and Field being a safe haven now. And oh, I guess, look, Hateno discovered psychedelics. As well as bigger changes like chasms and sky islands to actually motivate the player to run through this map again. But it's certainly less about peeking over the next corner and more about figuring out a way up into the sky, either by rewinding a stone through time, blasting Link out of a tower, or creating an entirely new method using the physics engine. And once you're up in the sky, well, what comes up must come down, either by seeing a massive chasm which motivates you to throw yourself off, or building a flying machine that goes wrong, and thus creates this vertically oriented loop, which is thanks in part to Link's new abilities. So yeah, Tears of the Kingdom reuses its map, and it's probably the best use of a reuse that I'm aware of. But really, Nintendo, $70 and you took away my Master Mode? That's kind of tough. I alluded to Link's new abilities enhancing exploration, so let's break those abilities down. Link can now zip through ceilings. I frequently forgot this existed, but I also forgot about cryosis, so that's that. Hey! And Tears of the Kingdom is more or less Rewind and Ultra Hand the game. Rewind is probably a foreign concept to the youth, but you can rewind time on just about any object in Tears of the Kingdom. And Ultra Hand is a toy that Nintendo released in the 1960s, which apparently allows Link to build contraptions and machines. And while both are extremely versatile on their own, the two can be combined to absolutely break this game. Where a lot of Breath of the Wild relied on physics-based puzzles, a lot of the core is still here in Tears of the Kingdom, but with MacGyvered machines interacting with the physics engine combined with time manipulation as an added highlight. And these two abilities make Link's ability to traverse basically infinite. I don't think these abilities work without the irreverence for the map. And finding the flexible physics-based solutions instills the same sense of accomplishment that Breath of the Wild's puzzles did. And lastly, there is Fuse, which allows weapons to be combined with items and is largely used to rectify the weapon durability system from Breath of the Wild. Combining weapons is silly and fun. There are essentially base weapon types, and attachments add durability and a predictable functionality. And in terms of functionality, I was left a bit underwhelmed. Often combinations yield a damage buff and maybe an elemental effect, but where I was left whelmed is how the system finds a happy medium for the durability haters. For the record, I liked the durability system, but two things are happening with Fuse. First, the increased durability with the Fuse, and second is the damage buff correlates to the difficulty of the monster that you killed. And this means that the player can almost be level capped by damage output in a sense. And the player can also recreate weapons they want to spend resources on, making the weapons that they want. And beating a tough monster has a reward of a cool loot Fuse with a Monster Hunter style kind of twist. And as a bonus, Fuse finds a use for all the junk that cluttered Breath of the Wild's menus. Now, my biggest issue with Fuse is concerning arrows, and it's a control issue. Pausing the game, horizontally scrolling through dozens of arrow attachments is not fun, Nintendo. And on the subject, Link can now throw these items that can be fused, which is a similarly agonizing process. First, prepare to throw your weapon, then hit another button, then horizontally scroll to what you want, and finally release to throw. For a game where a third of the map is bathed in darkness with the expectation that the player is going to throw and shoot light-emitting seeds, this is a serious ick. Speaking of that third of the map, let's talk about the depths, because there is a seedy underbelly to Hyrule, and Nintendo tried to pull an Elden Ring here by including this massive underground part of the map, and I really don't like it, mostly because it's extremely dark and the design of the area is extremely bland. And the design I think could be improved, but also two easy fixes which would greatly enhance my enjoyment of the depth would be to make it interconnected instead of segmented, and to allow for ascending out at the light checkpoints instead of these very, very rare areas where you can exit the depths. Because as it stands, the segmentation combined with the extremely sparse exit points often made me rely on fast travel, which I really try to avoid in Zelda. And the depths isn't the only thing I took issue with in Tears of the Kingdom. Let's talk about the dungeons. It's fair to say the most universally derided part of Breath of the Wild was the Divine Beasts. There were only 4 of them, they were extremely short, and they were more or less an asset flip. And if there was one thing Nintendo almost needed to do for Tears of the Kingdom, it was to add proper dungeons. And I think we've inched closer back to traditional Zelda, but we're not achieving its former glory and certainly not surpassing it. Older 3D Zeldas more or less followed a similar formula. It's a themed locale, it's a series of locks and keys which guides the player to a mini-boss, and after the mini-boss you get a dungeon item, which is then used to find the boss key and then the boss of the dungeon. And the dungeon item stays with Link for the rest of his adventure, and occasionally there is a gimmick to the dungeon. So let's take a little example. Majora's Mask's Stone Tower Temple. It's got a really cool theme. It's death, basically. Locks and keys lead the player to a key item, the light arrow. And then those light arrows are used to the dungeon's gimmick, which is flipping it 180 degrees on its head. And that's pretty cool, so how does Tears of the Kingdom do? Well, there are now themes, including themed music, which that alone is a godsend. And there are more than 4, but less than older Zelda titles, which is fine because we still have shrines, which don't worry I'm going to touch on, but the content of the dungeons is where I take pause. So there's 2 ways to look at this. The dungeons themselves are fairly disappointing, and just about as long as a Divine Beast. There are no key items, no mini-bosses, and not really any lock and key type of engagement to speak of. However, Nintendo did something kind of bizarre. You rewind back out of the dungeon, and we start to see classic Zelda dungeon design emerge. All of the dungeons require a quest to enter them, and that quest starts in a village, at one point has a mini-boss, and that mini-boss gives the player a companion, which becomes the equivalent of a key item. And entering the temple then becomes the equivalent of the second half of a traditional Zelda dungeon, which is fairly clever. The only thing that is truly missing is some of the items from earlier dungeons are used to solve puzzles in a current dungeon in past Zeldas, but because the dungeons are allowed to be done in any order, this is not the case in Tears of the Kingdom. So Nintendo really did strike a balance here. However, I would still prefer larger overall dungeons instead of having half of it take place outside the actual location. And there could be a bit more variety in the ultimate objective of each dungeon instead of activate 5 things and fight the boss of the dungeon. Still, it's a much improved step. But there's a lot more in terms of puzzle solving in Tears of the Kingdom. There are several large explorable areas like Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle, which finds this not quite dungeon combat focused trial, which I think is really cool, and I'm glad it was expanded on with additional areas in Tears of the Kingdom. And of course, shrines return as sort of mini dungeons. And here we have more than ever with some of my personal Breath of the Wild complaints addressed with the shrines, specifically tests of strength where Link previously had to fight copy-pasted enemies have been replaced with combat tutorials and Eventide Island-like challenges where the player is stripped of gear and needs to fight with the materials provided. These are great and I really just wanted more. My only complaint is that the shrines lack asset variety. Link is stuck in the same sterile room 150 plus times, which can get a little old. And my main overarching complaint with Tears of the Kingdom is starting to bubble up. Tears of the Kingdom suffers from what a lot of open world games suffer from, and this is highly recycled content. Dungeons with the same format, shrines with the same assets, and even a lot of quests, including within the main quest, are usually simple back and forth affairs. I'm specifically thinking immediately when you land in Hyrule, where Link has to go back and forth between the castle and Castletown, and the Zora quest, where there's just a lot of mindless back and forth between the mountain and the domain. And yes, there is an absolute ton to do, but watching the exact same cutscene for the 4th time can make Hyrule feel like less of a living, breathing world and more like a video game. But that really is the worst case scenario, and more often than not, there is absolutely sensory overload of things to do. In my Animal Crossing review, I coined the term Animal Crossing brain, where this seemingly never-ending queue of tasks is stacked up in my mind on a daily basis. Tears of the Kingdom is the first game since Animal Crossing to properly give me Animal Crossing brain again. Targeted destinations often get intersected by points of interest on the journey, which leads down a rabbit hole and ultimately lands you on the opposite side of Hyrule. And as discussed earlier, being in the sky doesn't help, because at any given time, there's a shrine, a chasm, a tower, or, oh look, a geoglyph. One of my absolute favorite parts of Breath of the Wild was the Memories quest, where Link had to position himself in spots throughout Hyrule where pictures were taken. It was such a cool way to leverage the open world, tie stories to locations, and I'm not really aware of any game that quite does the exact same thing. Tears of the Kingdom takes a new spin on this idea with the Geoglyph quest, and Nintendo took some inspiration from Peru, and I do appreciate the return of the quest, but I do think it is lesser to Breath of the Wild. I totally acknowledge a select few picture spots were pretty tough to track down in Breath of the Wild, so making massive geoglyphs is certainly easier, but I think there could have been a bit more of a middle ground between super niche spot and massive geoglyph. I think where the quest pales to Breath of the Wild is when you have to find the dragon tier within the geoglyph. There is an exact spot to trigger the memory, and often this is more frustrating than fun, especially considering the draw distance of the tier that you have to find. And I want to end the gameplay discussion of Tears of the Kingdom at the beginning. Breath of the Wild's Great Plateau is largely regarded as one of the best video game openings of all time, and I can totally vouch for that. It's a true microcosm of the world, which prepares the player for the entire rest of the game. So it only makes sense Nintendo would essentially copy and paste the formula for the Great Sky Island. And once again, we have a microcosm of the game, which shows this is a proper sequel by way of tons of new enemies and new classic enemies such as Like-Likes making a return. Sky Islands, caves, and without the paraglider, plenty of moments to use Ultra Hand, Ascend, Rewind, and Fuse. And the Great Island is lovingly crafted with an Elden Ring-like map design and hidden paths aplenty. But in Breath of the Wild, it's pretty easy to activate the shrines. I don't think many players would discover all 4 of the shrines accidentally before they become active. Tears of the Kingdom, however, puts the player at a split position. Go to the Temple of Time, or go to the Snow Mountain. I went to the Snow Mountain, and then I found the first shrine. And because the whole thing is a circle, I accidentally circumnavigated the Great Island and found every single shrine before going to the Temple of Time, which kind of sucked. And because the Great Sky Island is a circle, there is 100% an intended path, which is actually reflected in the entirety of the game. Tears of the Kingdom tries much harder to steer the player down a specific dungeon order, with kind of significant consequences if it's not followed. For example, the game really pushes the player towards Hebra and the Rito quest first. I did it last, and subsequently found myself missing the Lucky Clover Gazette quest until the end of the game. This meant I had found all 4 fairy fountains but could not upgrade my armor until the end of the game, in which I had to go back to all the fountains to do the quests that I could have done. And that's kind of just like the Great Sky Island in my experience. And Breath of the Wild's unfettered freedom 100% had downsides, but I think Nintendo struggled to find a balance on the tightrope here. Either allow for quests to be done in any order with no intended path, or make a linear path so players don't accidentally miss things the developers had expected the player to find. I thought Breath of the Wild's story was cringe. More specifically, I thought the acting and writing left a lot to be desired. I understand Breath of the Wild was largely evoking the original Legend of Zelda, including having a sparse story, but for someone who teared up at the iconic
"Open your eyes"
over a cup of noodles at my office lunch space, they kind of dropped the ball in their first attempt, in my opinion. And just because the game's non-linear doesn't mean that the story had to be told in the same way, in my opinion. But Tears of the Kingdom might be my favorite Zelda story. Now, don't get me wrong, I prefer themes explored in some Zeldas more, like Majora's Mask, and I enjoy the lore aspects of Skyward Sword, but holistically, I enjoyed the story of Tears of the Kingdom, at least in a vacuum, because holy shit, did they wreak havoc on the lore here. I'm not going to get into the timeline discussions, but no matter where this game sits in the timeline, it is very easy to ask some very legitimate questions that can break this game and series wide open. But where Tears of the Kingdom shines for me, miraculously, is in its characters. This interstellar romp made me care for and respect characters in a way I rarely do in video games. The quest Zelda goes on, and the sacrifices she and others make for people they assume they're never going to meet or see again is kind of inspiring. Both Zelda and Link are on equally important missions, but unlike Ocarina of Time or Breath of the Wild, we get to actually see the hardships of Zelda's mission while we experience Link's firsthand. The faith and trust imbued in others was uplifting in a wholesome way. Actually, in a way I seldom see even in film, but I think Ghibli has a knack for it. And yeah, this game, just like Breath of the Wild, loves Ghibli inspiration. From Prince Ashitaka's arm, to Patsu and Shita exploring the depths, to Zelda apparently moving in with Link in Hateno, which reminds me of another such village from Nausicaa. And of course, Zelda has a secret underground lab, just like in Nausicaa, where in the past, Link was simply an analog for the player, and Zelda's moments were few, far between, and mysterious. Tears of the Kingdom injects some wonderful character and captures Ghibli magic in a Zelda title. And speaking of Zelda, moving in with Link, or kicking him out of his house, I guess, maybe next to Skyward Sword is the most chemistry these two have ever had. And Link and Zelda haven't kissed in a while, and Zelda clearly crushes on Link in this game, and you are Link, so I was clearly crushing on Zelda in this game. I was kind of hoping for a kiss, which says a lot about me actually caring about these characters. But spoilers, I didn't get one, which makes me sad. And oh my god, this is a sad game. It's not macabre like Majora's Mask, it's just sad. And the title is apt, Tears of the Kingdom. The sacred stones look like tears. Zelda has tears literally painted on her face, which is weird because I would argue the Great Calamity was more dire and drastic. It basically wiped out Hyrule. But once again, the writing and presentation let you bask in these characters' sadness, loneliness, and at times even hopelessness. Zelda is a stranger in a strange world. The two are facing essentially impossible odds and at the disadvantage of not having one another at their side like they had for years. And it's not just Zelda. Several characters make choices with real consequences, and it landed for me. And yeah, I have huge issues with the blatant disregard for the lore, and not just disregard, but literal layup setups, which were completely ignored. And part of it is disappointing because the game is extremely aware of past games and timelines. Here are just a few samplings of the astounding attention to detail calling back to past games. Ganondorf kneeling in this cutscene, pledging loyalty just as he did in Ocarina of Time, floating Hyrule Castle in Ocarina of Time, and Ganondorf swinging around from his organ, like in Ocarina of Time. Nintendo is fully aware of the past games, but their refusal to do pretty obvious things for cool timeline tie-ins is fairly disappointing. That's my biggest gripe. I love the story of Tears of the Kingdom. My only other complaint is Nintendo got better about their non-linear storytelling since Breath of the Wild, but I still think that there's room for improvement. More significant stories can happen in the current timeline. So not just geoglyph memories, basically. As it stands, the stories are repetitive, especially in their delivery as cutscenes. Better, more diverse stories can be told, and more meta-plot events can happen besides just the front and back half of the game. But the geoglyphs fill the gaps between dungeons, assuming that's how you choose to play. I did all the geoglyphs before a single dungeon, so that might be an issue on me. But Nintendo did get better about endings, and certainly heard community feedback about Breath of the Wild's ending. And the absolutely insane ending of Tears of the Kingdom is nothing short of bombastic and spectacular from music, visuals, acting, and story. I prefer specific aspects of other Zelda stories more, but just as a simple story, let's strip the intellectual property out of the equation, I really like this tale of love across time and space. Now, there are really only two things for me to discuss on the presentation, and fair is fair. Tears of the Kingdom has frame rate issues, especially when using Ultra Hand, but this is a rare time and it can be excused. This isn't like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet or Redfall, because not only is Zelda bug-free, but it is an absolute technical marvel. And in fact, this isn't the first time a Zelda game has taken a frame rate cut. Ocarina of Time actually ran it 20 frames per second. Not occasionally, like the whole game, like they targeted 20 frames per second. And that game is frequently cited as the best game of all time. It absolutely blows my mind that Breath of the Wild ran like this during speedruns, and Tears of the Kingdom runs like this. And I honestly thought that Breath of the Wild was a technical marvel and still believe it is. In the beginning, I was immediately impressed with how much better the pop-in was handled and how vast the draw distances could be in the sky. Like, remember in Breath of the Wild on the Divine Sky Beast thinking it was cool just how high up you were, but knowing it was kind of like separate from the open world and you weren't actually like rendered in the world? Well, not anymore. And then I learned about the depths. And I thought, surely you can't jump from the sky seamlessly into the depths. Yep, you sure as hell can. And it just kept ratcheting up right to the very end of the game. In the early days of this channel, when it was just a silly podcast type of show, I frequently showered Breath of the Wild in praise of its verticality to the point where it became a running joke and still is to this day with my friends. And Tears of the Kingdom is honestly at least 10 times as vertical as Breath of the Wild. And I still think Breath of the Wild is a pretty damn vertical game. I kept thinking that this game had given me everything it could, and it simply kept delivering on a technical level. The physics, the verticality, the underlying interactions from Breath of the Wild, like the fire system, having all this and more running in real time on what's basically a smartphone from 2015 is honestly mind-blowing. Like, my 9-to-5 job is as a software engineer, and wow, this is simply one of the most technically impressive games in recent memory. And my God, the music in the game. Why did it take Nintendo so long to embrace orchestral tracks? One of my biggest complaints about Breath of the Wild is the music didn't hit quite the same. I longed for more, and Tears of the Kingdom strikes the perfect balance of being laid back and tickling in instruments at just the right time. The returning tracks are absolute bangers. The new tracks add enough to fill what I thought was a void from Breath of the Wild, and my goodness, the music during the cutscenes is mind-blowingly nostalgic with modern flair. I absolutely can't wait for the 40th anniversary orchestra. We need to mod older Zeldas with orchestral tracks. My body is ready. Seriously, these arrangements have Tears of the Kingdom firmly at OST of the year. Good luck, Starfield, I guess. So to me, playing Breath of the Wild is a lot like playing Outer Wilds. So much of it was hinged on novelty that playing it again just doesn't quite hit the same. And Tears of the Kingdom was a sequel which understood and leveraged familiarity by breaking the carefully crafted world wide open. So with this sequel, I think we're done with the Breath of the Wild map. And honestly, I hope we're ready to move on to some entirely new gameplay systems. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom has some of the most thorough exploration of any game engine and world I think ever. Especially because they share so much. They just kind of feel like one colossal game to me now. This is basically the game equivalent of Kill Bill for me. It's just one movie, and I can acknowledge each has its strengths over the other. But Tears of the Kingdom stands tall as a technical marvel on Switch, a sandbox unmatched by modern hardware, a compelling story, and one of the greatest games ever made.